Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Rick Arrowwood. I'm reaching out to you from Boston, Massachusetts at Northeastern University. And I'm here presenting for the third annual International Conference on International Law and Legal Policy. So I look forward to sharing with you my insights in terms of AI. And when I'm using the term AI, I'm referring to artificial intelligence and all things artificial intelligence. So for now, I'm just going to use the generalized term AI. That, of course, could include generative AI as well as LLMs and the like. So we'll just keep our conversation as simple as we possibly can. So glad that you're joining us today. Very, very much appreciated. Let's get started with sort of an outlook that I see as the AI revolution that is taking place in higher education specifically. So right now, AI is so transformative and disruptive, and oftentimes we think of it as that's just for businesses. But the reality is AI does come into higher education, I think, on a dual role. One, we as faculty have a responsibility to learn as much as we possibly can about AI. And that way we can teach it to our students. Now, one of the things I have found over the past year is that my students oftentimes are the ones teaching me because they're out in the community and they're doing the work. They're out at the co-ops or the internships. And so they're gathering quite a bit of information, bringing it back to me, and then I'm distributing it through the classroom. And quite frankly, that's how education should work. That's that industry connection and industry partnership. So I hope that you don't get overwhelmed by AI and say, it's just too much for me. My hope, of course, is that you're able to recognize the importance of AI and not become overwhelmed. So when we look at it in the higher education space, it's definitely transforming the way that we are functioning within an organization. Our challenges oftentimes is within technology generally. People are sometimes slow at adopting and adapting to technology. So if you're trying to implement something AI-oriented within your higher education, you might have that as your first stumbling block. So going to the keeper of the data, for example, and saying, I have a wonderful new idea. I'm going to revolutionize how we collect data and interpret that data. And you might get some immediate resistance. Now, that resistance could very well be because, quite frankly, they feel as though they're the keeper of the data, and how dare some new and innovative approach be taking to it? Perhaps. Perhaps there's some job insecurities. You have to look at those factors as well. But you also have to be alert to the legal issues involved in accessing data, particularly if it's in a higher education setting. So let me just take a look at the next slide that we have and look at it and frame this argument in terms of three buckets. Our first bucket is the benefit for the students. Second bucket would be advantages of faculty, and then those challenges. So from the student perspective, I saw overall within this first 1 year, a bit of hesitance by the students to use anything AI oriented. Now, of course, I'm excluding those within computers and data science colleges, etc. But within all the other colleges, I sort of anecdotally looked at some of my students and said, are you using ChatGPT? Well, now this was the interesting part that reminded me of the role of leadership within this notion of AI coming into the classroom. And that is, as faculty, you need to be the leader in the classroom. So as a leader, we communicate what our values are. We communicate our vision. We communicate how we want you to go about getting that work. And we remind you why this is so important. So within your syllabus, for example, you should have a fairly clearly articulated policy on the use of generative AI, for example, in producing essays. And so make sure that you as a faculty member are leading. So that's from the faculty perspective. That does benefit the students greatly because quite frankly, they're very clear on what your expectations are. And then over into the challenges. Well, look, the challenges are going to be what I am developing as the lie theory, meaning that you can certainly input a prompt into ChatGPT, be as specific as you possibly can, and you'll get a great piece of art, so to speak. You'll get a terrific essay, a terrific answer. You turn that in. A month later, the professor says, tell me about this particular word you chose, or tell me about this particular line, or tell me about what your intent was in this paragraph. And here's where the problem is going to come in. If you have relied solely on generative AI to produce your essay, the reality is you're not going to remember it 1 hour after it's printed or 1 hour after it's submitted. And you're certainly not going to do it 3 or 4 weeks later. That's why it's so very important that you are the content creator. The generative AIs are simply there to polish it up a bit. It is not there to create for you, because think about this. If you enter something, and I challenge you to try this experiment. Enter in and say, the prompt, write me an essay on World War II, but keep it to 3 pages. Okay, let's do that. And then 6 months from now, I want you to look at that paper and tell me, do you recognize anything that's on there? Probably not, because none of those are your words, okay? So now let's look at what AI is really doing in terms of higher education. If you are in a higher education administrative role, you need to be the one that's really helping set the parameters. Sometimes we say, well, we should have faculty do that. Well, the truth is faculty, quite frankly, are here to teach, facilitate the classes. And in doing so, while yes, they could be part of and should be part of a shared governance model, someone's got to take the lead. My advice is administration takes the lead, takes that first step in articulating some sort of policy, and then put that out. And then from there, each department can create a policy. And then within that sort of systematic structure, ultimately the college itself could create a uniform policy. And that policy, good part is, it could have maybe 2 or 3 different options of how you're going to permit, encourage, or discourage students from using generative AI. So policy adaptation is really important. Detection challenges, well, look, this is nothing new. Detection challenges have been around for beginning of time. We as faculty 10 years ago would check the sources manually. Is this the correct source and the correct citation and the correct page and the correct intent of the author? We would also look for other issues of plagiarism, for example. Did the student write this? Is it typical in terms of student data based on previous submissions? So we're already good at that, but what ChatGPT puts us into a position of is we have to get even better. And yes, there are some tools that are out there that will determine whether or not AI was used in the generation of an essay, for example. They have a long ways to go to get better. I use them, and I'm not particularly impressed by them. But then there's also other instruments which we've been using for quite some time. Turnitin, for example, a program embedded within our learning management system. And that goes out and searches all of the papers that have been submitted. See, with the ChatGPT, for example, it's searching anything that's available on the World Wide Web. Whereas the system called Turnitin is really focused in on that material which has been presented, and then perhaps some out on the web itself. One of the key parts I wanted to bring to your attention today, not so much the minutiae of the detail, but more along the lines of the aspects of legal education that you might run into, some of these major laws, regulations, key provisions, for example. The GDPR. So that data protection puts strict guidelines on how we can go about and what we can process. Whereas FERPA, that is a US law, has to do with who has access to the student data. And oftentimes it's once the student turns to the age of maturity, typically 18 years or so, it's the student data, that's who owns it, not the parent. So you have to look at what are those limitations. And then I think also in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I think you'll see a lot of laws that are going to come up, certainly regulations, in terms of how do we get this generative AI to be accessible to all individuals, regardless of any discriminatory factors, such as disabilities. I think one of the key aspects that you're going to need to think about is how are we going to build the infrastructure within our colleges and within our departments, and to what extent, how much resources are we going to put into it? Are we going to tap into the individuals that are already within our organization to help us develop and learn more? And what does that look like? What selection process do we go about, for example? In our design, are we being inclusive? Are we looking at the equitable aspects? I mean, at this stage, yes, most engines, ChatGPTs, Claude, etc., are free, but there are paid versions. The larger question at some point might very well become this issue of inclusion, equitable scenarios. What if the student in your classroom cannot afford the $20 fee, for example, to have a subscription to get that better version of some particular platform? So you want to think about that. We sort of already been there. We started thinking about textbooks, for example, and how do textbooks interact and lay within that term. Ethical frameworks, I believe, are essential as we are looking at AI coming in. Here's the thing. I've been around a while. I'm still amazed by the facsimile. You know, that fax machine that most people haven't even heard of. I'm still amazed at how that thing works. So my mind is still there. But at the same time, I'm one of these earlier adopters of technology. So I really like this aspect to try to figure things out. Now, what happens with the technology is that the systems are going to be there, but then do we know how to use them for the greater good? That becomes a fundamental question. Do we know how to use them for the greater good? So of course, you're going to need to go about what sort of approaches do you want to take from an ethical standpoint? Do you see that AI should be accessible by anyone and everyone? And if so, how do we go about ensuring that's available? How do we go about determining who owns rights to things, for example? So some of the trends I think that are going to become an issue will be this notion of how can we in the higher education realm personalize, possibly through chatbots, for example, how we help develop students. See, on the one end, you can look at higher education and say, well, for the most part, it's transactional, meaning student comes in, student takes a course, student gets the credit. Those number of credits add up, they get a degree. That's transactional. And hopefully they've enjoyed themselves as best as they could. But I think when I look at higher education, mine is more along the lines of how do we go about truly transforming our students? Now, the reality is, as faculty, we can't get everyone. But if we employ things like chatbots, for example, maybe that's a way to help us, to multiply us, if you will, to help us be able to work directly with a particular student. And so I think I see that's on the horizon. I think that's probably going to be one of our best takeaways. And then look, ultimately, this notion of virtual campuses during COVID, overall, most people didn't like the online environment. And listen, again, we can't expect people to adapt to technology quickly. It just takes a while. And so maybe in the longer term, this notion of virtual reality, augmented reality can come within the higher education setting. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about today. Thank you so very much, and I hope you've enjoyed today. Take care.